Hey folks, I'm Lou from Relab. Welcome to our webinar this morning on the proposed new rules around housing density. I'm just going to grab my co-hosts up on stage. Now there's a lot of you down here, so just give me 2 seconds while I find my co-hosts in this massive list of people. There's Foss, let me bring him on up. I'm going to actually have to use the search bar because there's a lot of you. I'm just going to bring up Knight. Michael. There's Knight coming on now. We'll just find Michael. Michael up. Okay, so I've just invited Foss and Michael up on stage as well. We'll just see if that's been successful. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Oh, hey, Mark from Ray White. Nice to see you here. So we've got Michael. Let's just see if Foss has got that. And there's Foss. Brilliant. Excellent. We'll just wait for Foss to jump up on screen. Hey, Foss, how are you?
G'day.
Good morning. Good morning, Craig and Pete from Harcourts. Hey, nice to see you guys here. So if you missed it, I'm Lou from Relab. I manage the marketing here at Relab and also take care of people. I'd like to introduce my guests today. We have Knight Hou, who is CEO and co-founder of Relab. We have Foss Shanahan, who's the CEO and co-founder of Rico up in Auckland. And we have Michael Campbell. Now, Michael is the director of Campbell Brown Planning up in Auckland as well. So today we've got a bit of a hot topic. We've got a lot of people joined our call today, folks. So it's definitely a topic of interest. We've had quite a bit of feedback already on our Facebook events posts that we put up there. Lots of people want to talk about this. There's a shed load of questions that are coming in, which is really fantastic. Yes, we are recording this webinar, Digma. You'll get a recording of this after the session's finished. So we're going to start with a little bit of context and setting the scene a little bit. So I'm going to hand over to Michael here. So Michael, what's the government trying to achieve with this piece of legislation? Who's behind it? What are the goals? What's the end goal here?
Yeah, sure. Thank you and welcome everybody. Look, I think you'd probably have to be living under a rock if you didn't realise that New Zealand has a housing crisis. And, you know, we sometimes think of that being in Auckland, but it's not just Auckland, it's New Zealand wide. And so the latest announcements are an out attempt by government to address the housing crisis. We've probably had a housing crisis for the last 10 years. And there's a whole range of reasons for why that's occurred. But one of the issues has been supply of housing. So first and foremost, the driver to this is around bringing further housing supply to the market. Now, there are a range of other reasons, and we kind of debate those. I don't think we're going to have time to fully debate all of those. But in terms of the objective of the legislation, is pure out and out about creating a regulatory environment that reduces red tape to supply housing to the maximum extent possible. I guess what I'd also say, and if people get a bit of time after this session and they want to kind of get a little bit more information, it's worth also Googling or researching the what's called the New Zealand Policy Statement on Urban Development, which was released last year. And that's the genesis for a lot of the decisions that have actually come about more recently. And the National Policy Statement on Urban Development was quite a transformative document because it's directing councils to really look at their planning and look at making more land available, particularly around corridors and nodes, say town centres, to intensify those areas along public transport and close proximity to amenities. What is really interesting about the policy statement is and it's quite a lengthy statement, so you won't read it out today, but Policy 6 in particular really signals a step change in planning in New Zealand. Traditionally in New Zealand, it's a lot more sort of effects-based, but what the policy, and I'm actually just going to read this policy out because I think that is the driver for a lot of the decisions that we've seen more recently. And what is particularly is the policy says that the planned urban form in the planning documents that councils are required to prepare may involve significant changes to an area, and those changes may detract from amenity values appreciated by some people, but improve amenity values appreciated by other people, communities, and future generations, including by providing increased and varied housing densities and types, and are not in themselves an adverse effect. Now, what that's effectively saying, to my mind, is in order to increase the housing supply, you actually need to get away from a lot of the traditional approaches to the RMA around effects in terms of things like shading, sunlight loss, dominance, privacy. And it's effectively saying that in order to achieve the intensification objectives of the national policy statement, that you're going to forego some of those amenity outcomes to the benefit of the wider community in delivering higher intensity housing. Jump forward to the recent announcements, and those are really looking to, I guess, give some teeth to those outcomes, particularly in relation to the residential context, which is effectively enabling the medium density residential zones to apply across an urban area, particularly in relation to the tier 1 local authorities. And that is going to result in particular some significant changes. I guess I've responded to that, hopefully. There's probably more questions than answers. Yeah.
No, you definitely have. So, Michael, how do these proposed changes compare with the current unitary plan in Auckland?
Yeah, I guess I'm conscious that, you know, we have people here in the audience that aren't just from Auckland, but in the Auckland context, we have a unitary plan. We probably have in the order of 5 key zones. In the residential context, they range from sort of large lot to single house to medium density, mixed housing suburban, mixed housing urban, and then your terrace housing and apartment zone. In many cases, the Auckland Unitary Plan is actually a very progressive plan and is actually seeking to deliver quite significant intensification. So in a couple of the zones, the medium density rules probably are there or thereabouts. So for example, in the terrace housing and apartment building zone, the provisions within that are actually more generous than what the medium density rules that are proposed actually allow. The closest zoning that would align with the government's announcement would be the mixed housing urban zone, which provides for 3 dwellings as a permitted activity. It provides for a height of 11 metres. The new rules provide a bit more flexibility about building coverage. It allowed 50% versus 45%, and a reduction in things like outlook. So in the current rules, you have a 6x4 outlook for privacy, whereas in this proposed scheme, it's 3 metres, and a reduction in private open space. In the lower zones, there will be significant changes. In the single house zone, we are allowed 1 dwelling per 600 square metres. That is a significant change from that current context to allowing sort of basically 3 levels dwellings, 3 units up to 3 levels. And likewise in the mixed housing suburban, the mixed housing suburban zone provides for 3 dwellings as a permitted activity, but only really for 2 levels. Outside of Auckland, I think there's probably going to be some more dramatic changes, because I think a number of existing local authorities probably have first generation plans, and a lot of those plans are probably set up at a much lower density and a much lower urban delivery. So I think outside of Auckland, the jump in many areas could be, in tier 1 town cities at least, could be quite dramatic in certain suburbs.
Obviously up in Auckland, so I work remotely down here. There's certainly a lot of changes to be had down here in Dunedin. I know that we're sitting on a rather large property here that could potentially be sort of 3 different sites, but I think it's also people's mindsets. It's that whole NIMBY thing, sort of not in my backyard. So I wonder how that's also going to go down in certain areas, potentially around here in Dunedin, maybe Christchurch or Wellington as well. Michael and Foss. So if this legislation goes ahead in its current form, how is that going to impact your respective work?
Foss, maybe do you want to go first, and then maybe I'll follow up?
Yeah. So basically, by way of background, the company I work for has a platform for people preparing resource consent applications on it, and it's a digital environment for doing that. And the implication of that is we can see on our platform who's applying for what reasons for consent. And so coming into this webinar, I did a little bit of analysis before to see exactly what the implications of this would be on the resource consent applications of the past kind of year and a half in Auckland. And so we basically looked at a sample of around 400 consent applications and looked to see the effect of these rule changes. And so the effects were quite interesting. So the number of applications which would not require resource consent anymore was 1%. So 99% of the applications would still require resource consent. That being said, let me just pull up the number here. Around 63% of the applications involved standards like your height in relation to boundary, your setback, your building coverage, your outdoor living space, and your outlook space that are affected by these changes. So while there's only a very small amount of applications that will no longer require a consent, just 1%, there is a large number that will be affected. And so of those applications that are affected, the question then is, do these become much more simpler applications? Do they go through council faster? I would imagine other questions in developers' minds. And the answer to that is not that straightforward either, because the fact is that it's a rule that's changing. So for example, like a height in relation to boundary rule, which manages the building's bulk and location in relation to the neighbours. When you're infringing that, once it's infringed, how that's addressed by council is very variable. Like in an area where there's a neighbour who will be quite adversely affected by an infringement like that, the council are going to be more sensitive to that, and it's in their discretion to be so. But in other areas, it might not matter so much. So the severity of an infringement is kind of something that we can't really understand from a high level, and they are addressed on a case-by-case basis. What I can say is we looked at the reason why there's such a difference between how many applications that are affected, that around 60%, and the number that removed a consent altogether, around 1%. We did look at, of the average application, what portion of the infringements in those applications are affected by these changes. And to that effect, we found that around 17% of the infringements of those applications affected are now going to be they're going to be less severe. So those are kind of like a few high-level numbers, and I can drill into them a bit more if we get questions. But I feel that those kind of point to the questions on people's minds of, at a system-wide level, how much does this reduce the need for resource consents? And the answer is not many, because pretty much every resource consent has a number of issues, like earthworks, or you might be in a heritage zone, or transport rules are another big one, or subdivision. But then the next step beyond that is how much complexity does it reduce? And the point to make there is it doesn't actually change the way applications are assessed. It's still the same Resource Management Act, and the councils still have to make the same considerations with respect to neighbours, the wider environment, and how the application meets the objectives and policies of their plans which they make. And so, I'll maybe pass on to Michael from there.
Yeah, look, I generally agree with Foss. I think you're probably still going to have a few what I'd call ankle tap consenting requirements, things like earthworks, works in a floodplain, or traffic matters. But I do think if the legislation does go through as proposed, it will create probably a degree of certainty in terms of some of the urban rules, in terms of if you comply with those rules, then the discretion is removed. That has some implications in terms of urban form outcomes, to my mind. But if I look at what I do in terms of our company, to be perfectly honest, we don't do a lot of 2 or 3 unit developments. Most of the sites that are getting developed at the moment are actually doing more than 3 dwellings under the current rules in the unitary plan at least. And so I don't think that's suddenly going to change. I think people will probably continue to seek more units for their sites than perhaps 3 as a sort of a broad rule. But it might provide a little bit more certainty to certain consents around, I guess, what you'd call your planning envelope, sometimes termed the permitted baseline, because it's the government's kind of locking in, if you like, on a residential site, a permitted baseline in terms of effect. But once again, I can probably say that count on the hand the number of consents we do in a year that just involve 3 dwellings on a residential site. So I think I actually agree with Foss. I think from a consenting point of view, probably the volumes will be on a par. But what you might see is some of the complexity might go down. The counter to that is the way the rules are pitched at the moment, to my mind at least, it's my opinion, but is you do have the potential for some poor outcomes in terms of urban form.
Foss and Michael. Hey, Foss, just a question for you. So how much time do you think the rules will save in the development and planning process, or not at all?
Yeah, so I mean, building on the answer to the last question in terms of what it will actually change in terms of what's to be considered. So looking at a consent application from a purely kind of systematic point of view of how many infringements are there to be dealt with here. So it's just an important bit of background information. A resource consent is only required when you're doing something that isn't permitted. So these rules expand the envelope, as Michael said, of what is permitted, and you only need the resource consent for what's outside of that. So in terms of reducing the need to lodge an application, there's like negligible effect. In terms of those that are being lodged, I think primarily the timeframes will be reduced in relation to rules like height in relation to boundary infringements. I would say that, like, speaking generally, like, of these changes, the height in relation to boundary change is probably one of the biggest in terms of the change in the rule. Like, in many zones, they have a 3 meter high where the recession plane starts, and that's been pushed up to, I think it's
6 meters.
6 meters and a 60 degree. So at the current, most zones are 3 meters high and then a 45-degree recession plane. And that's now been pushed up to 6 meters high and a 60-degree recession plane. And so those issues, because it's dealing with a boundary activity where your neighbour's right there, have traditionally been very, something the councils are very concerned about, because you've got the neighbour there to complain and to have effects on them. So I kind of see if the rules go through, those issues will be probably the biggest complexity removed out of the process. But beyond that, you still have, as I said, it's kind of only on those applications affected, it's less than 20% of the infringements are changed. So there's still quite a high number of other issues to be addressed. And you still have to lodge an application, and you still have to talk with the council, and you still have to go through the process. So it might result in slightly less complexity, but I don't see it being a kind of a silver bullet or anything of that magnitude.
Hey, Knight, I just want to jump over to you for a bit. So I see both in our list here and in our messages, we've got quite a few real estate agents here. We've got Barfoot, Ray White, Harcourts, everyone's represented. So what will this mean for real estate agents and potentially for them dealing with their clients?
Morning, everyone. Welcome. From where we stand, I guess I can only say that I represent a Relab. We are the software platform that helps property professionals, and many of our users are real estate agents. From a Relab's point of view, we see the need for us to present information, data, and insights for our users so that they can make the best decision in their professions. Specifically when it comes to real estate agency and what they do, I guess many agents tell us that their customers are inquiring about, hey, what does this medium density mean for their property or for property that they look to purchase? The first thing I want to do is hold a webinar and invite, Mike and Foss. You guys are the professionals when it comes to urban planning point of view. And second advice or observation that we have is many people are jumping ahead to conclusions in terms of assuming that this piece of legislation is already a done deal. All this means is some of the misconceptions, I guess, is right, all single house zoning, you will be able to put 3 dwellings and they will all be overnight 3 stories high. And when we're hearing this feedback, we really want to open a forum like this and go, actually, let's discuss some of the misconceptions and kind of put this proposed plan proposed change in the right context so that we can have a conversation like this. So long story short, as from a Relab's point of view, we want to provide the forum for us to have this discussion, but also present facts for people, because there is a lot of misconception out there.
If I could maybe just add something as well, just to give people a kind of a tangible what this might physically mean. We've been approached by a number of either residents or clients who are sort of wanting to understand the implications. And I work through a site in Grey Lynn, which is a traditional site in a single house zone, for example, in Auckland. And just by way of a comparison from people who aren't in Auckland, the single house zone in Auckland is a low density zone. It provides for basically 1 dwelling per 600 square meters, and the height is 8 meters, so probably provides generally 2 level dwellings. So 1 dwelling per 600 meters, 2 levels, usually has a building coverage allowance of 35%. Now those metrics are probably quite common throughout New Zealand. 2 levels, 600, maybe 500 square meters per lot, and 35% building coverage. Now, in the context of the implications of a site like that coming in and getting the medium density standards imposed on it, what that will mean is if you took say, for example, a 500 square meter site and you build a 2-story dwelling, that would actually, on a 500 square meter site, that would enable, I think from my calculations, I'm a planner, not a mathematician, but that's a 350 square meter house. 1 single dwelling. Now, if you kind of transpose the new rules, effectively that would allow 3 dwellings up to 3 levels, and it would allow gross floor area at 50% coverage for a 500 square meter lot of 750 square meters. So we are talking about some significant changes in certain contexts in terms of the existing planning frameworks that probably apply not only to Auckland, but to a wide range of other urban areas throughout New Zealand, and what the medium density rules are seeking to deliver. So make no mistake, in certain contexts, this is a significant step change in built form that could be enabled by these rules.
I see there's a few questions coming in, but I'm going to actually just leave those till the end because we've just got 2 more things we're going to discuss, and then we'll jump to questions. Michael, 2 things. What are the next steps for this piece of legislation, and is there room for misconceptions?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is the announcements are a bill, so they are going through a select committee process. I think submissions are still open, and so it's not over, or it's not adopted until it's adopted. But we do have cross-party support for the proposed changes, and that doesn't happen all the time. So, as I said at the start, this has become a political football for both parties. Both parties have being sort of whacked around the ears on this issue, and they're trying to get it resolved. They're trying to put it to bed politically. And from my point of view, there's a reasonable probability that this will come through in some form. There may be some changes around the edges, but as I understand it, it's scheduled for the enact to come into effect basically at the end of this year, so December, that they're trying to get it adopted. Assuming that goes through, and there may be some nips and tucks here and there, the legislation will direct councils to update their plans by August next year. So they will have to release plan changes that will basically give effect to the directives of the Act. And what the Act says is when those plan changes are notified, the rules are operative, effectively operative. Now, the one thing to just bear in mind is, like all policies, there are some exceptions to the rule. And this is where there's going to be some significant debate amongst the community and the development sector. So what the rules say is, basically in an urban area, you need to apply the medium density rules to urban areas in Tier 1 authorities. And I can give you the list of those Tier 1 authorities. And there is the ability for the council to exclude areas by what's called qualifying matters. Now, those qualifying matters could, and they're going to be up for debate, they could include things like heritage or significant ecological areas. So, in the Auckland context, I kind of think of a place like Titirangi, which has quite significant ecological areas. I suspect that those areas of Titirangi will be excluded. Where there'll be significant debate is around this matter of what constitutes heritage versus character. And in the Auckland context, we have a number of suburbs which have additional layers of protection because of their character area. And those are places like Ponsonby, Grey Lynn, Devonport, Remuera, Parnell. And so there's going to be some significant debate around whether or not those areas fall in to be a qualifying matter versus potentially upzoning some of those areas. And there'll be substantial debates on those issues. There's a range of other matters, qualifying matters, iwi issues, environmental issues, streams, waterways. So it's not a carte blanche that all areas will be subject to the NDSR provisions. Activities near the coast may have some controls on them where they impact on the coastal edge, areas near streams. So those things will all flush out when the council prepares its plan change. That'll be a public process and people will be able to submit. That's a typical process where people can say, well, hey, we think council, you've got it wrong. This area should be in the NDSER or this area should be excluded. And that's where there's going to be some pretty significant and challenging debates.
Hey, Michael, can I ask a quick question based on what you've just said, please?
Yeah, sure.
I think what you've just described is a really clear process, correct me if I'm wrong, that the current proposed changes is a bill and its amendment to the RMA, which has been done at the central government level.
Yes.
If it goes ahead in its current form, then the next steps are for regional, district and city councils to, what's the word?
They have to give effect to it.
Give effect to it. And that's when a lot of the details will be flushed out. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. But the way planning and the RMA works, it's a hierarchy. So you've got the RMA, which is kind of your umbrella. Then you've got your national policy statements. And then you start to have things like regional policy statements, regional rules, and then district plans. And all of those provisions need to be in accordance with one another. So councils can't ignore national policy statements. They have to give effect to them. Now, there'll be some interpretation. And what I'm suggesting is in the area of qualifying matters, there's going to be some pretty robust debate over what constitutes a qualifying matter.
Is there a current definition or a proposed definition for
in the national policy statement? There is a prescribed list of matters that are qualifying matters, And I can just give you the reference for people who might be interested. If you Google that, it's clause 3.32 of the National Policy Statement. And that lists the qualifying matters. And there's quite an extensive list. But, the council has to be very wary of applying those.
So we're just going to have one final discussion, and then we're going to go to, there's a lot of questions. So for everybody, how do you think that the proposed new changes will impact the way we live, say, in the next 10 years with the higher density? We'll go to you first, Knight.
Listeners who are online, I mean, I'm currently living in Auckland. I've got a young family. I do want to see just for us in our community, a better outcome. That's based on medium to long-term thinking rather than a knee-jerk reaction to a short-term change. I mean, I'm not a planner. I'm purely saying that from a personal point of view as someone who lives here in Auckland. I do think that there are a lot of questions in the channels asking about various aspects of this proposed law change. Please spend some time reading up on what Michael has suggested, our national policy or statement, and just get involved in the decision-making process and share your perspective. I think there's still opportunity for us to do that. My second observation is, if we believe that there is the free market mechanism and there's always a supply and demand, I think if you're a developer, if you're an agent working out there, you got to think about who your end customers are, what sort of outcome do they want to have for this stage of their life and their living conditions, and what product, quote unquote product, what dwelling, what neighborhood, and what community that they want to live in and raise their families in. So that's something that you probably need to consider in context of this proposed change. And the third one is, is the market overreacting or getting ahead of itself in terms of, boom, here's a proposed law change. Does it equal to all single house zoning will have 3 dwellings with 3 levels high? I think based on what we've heard so far, it's not a black and white situation like that. So that will be my opinion and my observation.
Cool. I might jump in next then. Well, so obviously it's a forecast, so it's just going to be my opinion. I guess what the changes kind of look to enact from my perspective is, and Michael mentioned earlier, is very similar to Auckland's mixed housing urban zone at the moment, with perhaps the biggest, with a caveat to that being the height in relation to boundary change is quite different. And what we've seen in Auckland is this real kind of uprising of the terraced houses. And as someone kind of not on the property ladder and potentially looking to be in years to come, the terraced housing typology kind of really appeals because it has, I guess, and that's a product, I guess, is the end product which you're looking to be providing for these cities, because it kind of strikes a balance between what New Zealand used to have in terms of kind of standalone houses, not really apartment living and super high density like you see in overseas cities, but also having the benefits of density, which is kind of shared amenities of having like town centres and close to areas where people can, and open spaces and those sorts of things get a lot more utilised when there's more density around them, and a lot more vibrant as well. So in the next 10 years, I don't actually see these changing the way we live, unless you live in a single house zone and your next door neighbour puts up a 3-story building. That might change the way you live a little bit. But in terms of the general trend we've already seen come into effect with the unitary plan of these terraced housing typologies becoming very dominant, I kind of just see this as enabling more of a continuation of that. And that's kind of a product which seems to be catching on quite well with the market.
Yeah, I guess, and I agree with Foss and with Knight. I think particularly in the Auckland context, and sorry to bang on about that to people who are not in Auckland, but Auckland's already on a journey of intensification, and if you've been, you only need to drive around to see what's happening, particularly in the last 5 years in terms of the scale of development that is occurring. So in some respects, this will kind of bring forward some of this development into admittedly other areas, but I think some of the outcomes will continue on the path of intensification that is occurring. Once again, I think where the rubber hits the road in terms of the outcomes is very much the quality of the outcome, because you are basically, to a degree, taking away that council control of scrutinising consents. And, we can argue that rightly or wrongly, but, to my mind, there is a risk that certain areas or certain projects are going to lead to some pretty adverse environmental outcomes. It's that being said, I think, and it's always difficult to predict what a market might do, but I think in increasing this level of supply, I think good quality developers more and more are going to be competing with one another in terms of bringing quality product to the market, because, trying to be optimistic here, if supply does increase and the market is more competitive, then I think it will be beholden to quality developers to try and make sure that they're delivering product that the market wants. Unfortunately, at this current environment, we have a situation where the housing demand is so high. I mean, you could sell a chicken shed and someone would buy it. So that's I think the very real risk. But the positives, I think there's some real positives in terms of the intensification aims, particularly around making efficient use of existing infrastructure. I mean, I kind of look at Ponsonby Road, for example, and I'm slightly off topic here, but it's a little bit of a pet topic of mine. If you look at Ponsonby Road, it currently has a restriction to height of 13 metres, which effectively only allows 3 stories, which effectively means that probably a lot of those sites don't get redeveloped because the capital incentivisation to demolish a 1-level building and just build a 3-story building just isn't there. And so if that area was able to be upzoned to, say, 6 levels in line with the directions of the national policy statement, I think it would encourage more intensification. And then what better place, to my mind at least, to provide for intensification with an area that's close to public transport, close to the city centre, close to a whole range of existing public parks and amenities. And, decisions like that will sort of really help us to avoid sort of expanding into our wider sort of rural areas.
Just on that point, Michael, we've got a question here, if I can find it. There we go. Do you think the intensification will drive values for larger lots in the regions up, or will it have the opposite effect? Do you mean in terms of for people who want? There'll always be a market for people who don't want intensification. And so I think areas that are excluded from there will have a certain value and appeal to certain people. It's people will always aspire. There'll be an element of people who don't want that intensive living. So to that extent, you might see some more attraction for people wanting to get out of urban areas and maybe get into more sort of countryside living style environments, or those areas that are character areas. They'll become more attractive for people who sort of covet that more spacious lifestyle, and that will inevitably have an impact on prices. I've heard anecdotally, at least from a number of clients, that land values have already taken a bump up on those people of speculating that certain single house zones will be, if they can go from 1 dwelling to 3 dwellings to the level of intensity I described earlier, then people are putting a value on that already. And the market will respond to the regulation. Just in that vein, Lisa asks, how will the lack of infrastructure be addressed? Many suburbs already have a lack of schooling, medical, roading, public transport, etc. It's a really valid question, and I think a lot of people...
It's an extremely excellent question, and it's probably an issue that, if I'm honest, New Zealand planning is probably, and infrastructure planning is not really grappled. And it's it's a bit of a case of the tail wagging the dog. I think there are some significant challenges in us delivering on infrastructure, schooling, wastewater, transport matters, public transport. There is a bit of a chicken and egg here, and I think the principle is if you build it, they will come, and so there will be some growth pains on those areas, and there probably will be some areas that while they have the development potential, there's simply not the capacity to actually tap into wastewater and things like that. So yeah, it won't be as simple as I think the government is making out.
Yeah, Mark's got a good point here in the chat. He says, I'm originally from the UK and live in London. If Auckland wishes to be seen as a livable city, then housing and infrastructure have to happen, but the building designs need to be of good quality and enhance the community for the future. Looking at other European cities, for examples around the world, I think that's a fairly relevant point. You want to talk to that?
Yeah, it is. Look, I guess particularly in the New Zealand context, the Building Act designs buildings to a life of 50 years. And I'm not involved in the Building Act, but I guess that's my concern is if we don't think about the quality outcomes, what city may we get in the future? There's some really good development occurring in Auckland. That's high quality design. I think of companies like Ockham or New Zealand Living, and a lot of the bigger building companies are building quality housing, which I think is really great. But there is a real risk that when you add this, the lowest level of the building code with the lowest level of regulation in terms of planning, you do create the potential for some pretty poor outcomes in certain areas. Now, in some areas, that probably won't be an issue because the value of the land probably justifies that. If someone's trying to develop somewhere in Greyland or Ponsonby, they're not going to underdevelop the land. But that decision is quite different to someone who's looking to develop a site perhaps in South Auckland or West Auckland in an area that's not as affluent. And I think that has the potential to lead to some potentially adverse outcomes.
Absolutely. So we've really run out of time, folks, but Knight or Foss or Michael, have you seen any other questions in the messages that you really want to address before we wrap things up?
Not really. I think I've prattled on enough. On the one hand, I'm a passionate Aucklander. I didn't come from Auckland, but I think it's a fantastic city, and I'm optimistic. I have some concerns that we could get some poor outcomes, but I also do think, and picking up what Foss said, I've got young kids, and the jump to get into housing in New Zealand is just too hard. So there does need to be a bit of a balance. I'm not personally convinced that this is the silver bullet that's going to address things. We have a whole range of other matters in terms of costs of materials, costs of resourcing, lack of investment in apprenticeship schemes, lack of trades to assist. I think a lot of those issues haven't been addressed, and right now as a planning company, we are flat out. We are working flat out with so much work going on. So it isn't necessarily a case that there isn't development occurring. I can tell you this: if anyone's in the construction industry, they will know they are at peak load capacity here. So it's not a case of we can't build enough because there's not enough consenting work happening. It's the only thing really holding us back right now is resourcing.
I absolutely agree. If we think of the end-to-end process of turning a piece of either infill or greenfield land into housing outcome dwellings, right? You go through the process of secure the land, apply for a consent, go for the design, getting the consent design approved, and then you do your earthworks and civils in your building, which is construction, and then you finish the product, quote product, which is different type of dwellings, and then sell it to the whoever would like to buy them. There are a number of bottlenecks along this process. I think what we talk about today, which is NDRS, the proposed change to RMA, is addressing the beginning part of this, which is resource management, high-level national planning, which is yet to be quote-unquote digest into resource plans, and there are other qualifying matters. But then if you look ahead, there is what Mike touched on, your resourcing, skilled people, looking at building code and deliver a good product. We even touched on the inflation in cost of building, cost of development. So there are multiple levels of capacity in developing to consider those, how to navigate those, but still deliver a good outcome for the community.
Yeah, absolutely, Knight. Foss, do you have final comments?
I would just tag on again to what Michael and Knight have said in the sense that what these changes kind of represent one solution in what is a very complicated problem with a lot of factors. As has already been discussed, in terms of the building supply, I just looked at the number of building consents in Auckland for the last year, and it's at 20,000 new dwellings. And I believe the Auckland plan, which is made by Auckland Council to allow for population growth, has allowed for or has predicted that we need 320,000 new dwellings over 30 years. So give or take 10,000 new dwellings a year. So it does really seem to be a case that the buildings are being consented, and they've got permission to be built, and it's the construction industry, to my knowledge, is working at kind of full steam to build those dwellings. So it does look like, in terms of the initiative to build more houses, is there, and it's just a matter of our feet catching up with our heads. I do tend to think that these changes might be oversimplistic in some areas, and there's obviously been a lot of thought going to the unitary plan to get us where we are in Auckland. And this, in many ways, overwrites a lot of that work. But as I say, it's a very complicated issue, and it's oversimplifying things to think that one thing can solve such a complicated issue when you're dealing with so many things like transport, infrastructure, different people's preferences about what kind of houses they want to live in, and what they want their neighborhoods to be like. That's kind of all I'd say.
Yeah, thanks, Foss. We're going to wrap up now, folks. We've gone to 15 minutes. We've gone quite a bit over time, and we could continue to discuss this for a long time. In fact, we possibly will do a follow-up to this, or maybe do a Facebook Live where we can answer some more of your questions, because there is quite a few that we haven't been able to get to today. So just want to thank Michael and Foss for joining us here today. There will be a recording of this sent to your inboxes from Demio, the platform that we use. There'll also be, if you have ticked yes to receiving more information, there'll be an email coming to you with information on how to get hold of Foss and how to get hold of Michael. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure hosting you, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lou, for moderating.